Welcome to the second half of this Keiser Report Summer Solutions Series. Today we're talking to Professor Steve Keen about how to address the very real concerns of Americans who used to have good blue-collar jobs but now find themselves not only clearing tables at McDonald's while injecting anti-diarrhea medicine into their eyeballs, but also voting for the likes of Donald Trump, who promises to make America great again. Is there any way to bring jobs back to America? Stacy?
Yes, we're going to talk about the solutions to the fact that America is no longer great. Mm-hmm. And I know that the two of you had done some interviews just a few weeks ago once Donald Trump had announced that he would default on U.S. debt. But the important thing about that is he said he would default on the debt that he accumulated as president building infrastructure. He said he would borrow trillions of dollars to rebuild infrastructure across America and then default on the debt. So maybe he shouldn't announce it. That's probably not a good way to negotiate some sort of loans to build this. But is infrastructure a good idea, kind of like FDR?
It's a great idea, and the thing is, he doesn't have to default to do it. This is he has to learn, Donald, you will own your own bank. Okay, and if you are willing to run a deficit, which is not a problem because you've taken up plenty of debts in the past, run a deficit and have it financed by the central bank, you can build other infrastructure. There's actually been a bunch of lefties you probably wouldn't get along with called the American Monetary Institute arguing this case for the last 20 or 30 years. Donald might actually do it when he works out the accounting and realise the lefties have got the accounting right. They could build all this infrastructure just by underwriting it with Federal Reserve money creation.
In a global economy, does somebody have to run a deficit? Can all nations run surpluses?
That's a beautiful question. That's a beautiful question because all this stuff of politicians all believing they should run a surplus while the private sector saves and everybody else saves is saying we should all be on the same side of the seesaw. We should all be up in the air at the same time. And one person's deficit must be absolutely exactly everybody else's surplus, or vice. If one is up, the other's got to be down because your surplus means you're taking money out of somebody else's cash reserve. So one is the other. There has to be an overall balance.
Now, as Max said, a lot of Americans have voted for Donald Trump through the primaries, and he has gone around the United States saying he's vowing to make America great again. Now, we've had NAFTA and other trade deals in America, and they have delivered cheaper goods to Americans, but at the cost of some very well-paying blue-collar jobs and manufacturing jobs, which the workers had some sort of dignity and community, and now that's all gone. And we see, for the first time, the actual change in mortality rates in America for this group of people. They're killing themselves in record numbers. The record number of suicides, also record numbers of opioid overdose deaths. Yeah. Now, is there a way to change that? Is there a way to end? Is it the trade deal's fault, or what is causing? What could bring a manufacturing back and dignify jobs?
The trade deals and the relocation of production from America to the third world were a major part of it, without a doubt. So, I was in China in 81, 82. I went to the Shenzhen Free Trade Zone as it was being constructed. They were still laying the concrete, and met with the managers of the centre there, and their argument was that there was a loophole in the American trade laws that enabled an American country to relocate production overseas and then import back the components they worked on without paying any tariff duties on the extra value added in the overseas location. So the Chinese were going to exploit that because they could offer an enormous price advantage in doing that. Rather than paying an American worker like $1,000 a week, let's say, you'd pay a Chinese worker $1,000 a year, and at that point, and so the cost advantage will all go to the owners of the firm. So that the capitalists and the corporations who did that transfer saw themselves paying a lot less to their workers, sacking their workers and paying a lot less to workers overseas, and then taking it back and taking the extra money and profit margin. So that's what they did. The Chinese were clever to say, if you do that at the same time, you've got to establish a link with a Chinese venturer, and within 5 years, that Chinese partner has to own half the business.
The Communist Party is famous for doing their 5-year plans. Yeah. So the Chinese government takes these with plans, but the U.S. refuses to do plans because that's communist.
And they get screwed by somebody who does plan well. So the Chinese managed to relocate all this work off to off to China, huge increase in Chinese employment, a huge drop in American employment. Now, the neoclassical economic fantasy is those workers will be relocated elsewhere inside the economy, which is at full employment and in equilibrium. It's in neither. It wasn't in full employment. It's never been in equilibrium. So those workers who lost their jobs simply lost their jobs. They go onto the slack heap. They might find a lousy job in McDonald's, as you're saying, but their dignity is gone, and certainly their income and cash flow is gone.
Their purchasing power remained the same, however, because of the cheapness of those goods coming in from China. So in other words, you may have lost a bunch of money trading down from a manufacturing job to a waiter job, but the cost of your clothes, the cost of your computers, the cost of your TV sets went down quite dramatically. So you had the experience of not having a tremendous reduction in your quote-unquote lifestyle.
Not as much, but it was the change. Most of that, a lot of that cost transfer, like dropping the cost of production, didn't come across as cheaper prices. It became as a larger profit margin.
But the prices people paying in their tract homes in the middle of Nowheresville, America, for slave-made electronic goods and TV sets dropped precipitously, and the balance was made up with cheap credit.
That is, part of the issue.
So they did. In other words, if you're a working class person in America, and the type of the job that you have went from a high-paying manufacturing job to a junk McMick job.
Yeah.
If the stuff coming in from China was cheap and the availability of credit, you're still going along in this lifestyle, so to speak,
So
plus
long as the
food
credit-
stamps.
As long as the credit keeps on rising.
Right.
But we hit the brick wall of credit in 2008 and it hasn't risen since. They can't continue borrowing. They won't be lent. They don't want to take on the debt.
I have a chart.
Yep.
I have a chart about that.
I think I've seen that one before.
So this is U.S. total credit market debt as a percentage of GDP. Now, I want to point out that one of the best times, the golden age of American workers, 1950 to
Low
1985. And yet, look how little leverage there was in the economy. And yet we hear over and over, all the financial news, our governments will tell us that we need all this leverage, we need cheap credit, we need all this debt. And yet, this was when it was best.
That was the golden age of American capitalism, and it was because so little of the cash flow had to be used to service the debt.
So it could go back into the economy, into productive capacity.
You reduce the debt, you don't have the same need to service the debt, your prices can be lower, your revenue is, more of your revenue goes towards wages and profits.
The household debt.
Yeah, both household and corporate debt. Both household and corporate debt got down to a trivial level during you've got 125% as the bottom of that chart. About 80% of that or more, about 90% is government debt. At the time of the end of the Second World War, private debt was of the order of 30 or 40% of GDP. And most of that was corporate debt. So the servicing costs were incredibly low. Now corporate debt's 4 times as high, household debt's about 6 times as high. So far more of the money goes to service the mortgage and service the existing debt. And if you don't do that, you go bankrupt. So you have to do it. That puts the floor on your cost level. If you could drop those financing costs, and Michael Hudson makes this case all the time, you could pay workers less. They could be more competitive with overseas. A main reason why they can't survive on the wages you would pay for Chinese workers is because they're paying far higher levels of debt than the Chinese workers are paying.
Yes.
Now, the theme here is summer solutions.
Yes.
So what are these solutions we're exploring?
I'm going Sherlock Holmes here. Okay, and as one of the Sherlock Holmes' famous sayings was that when you have eliminated every other possible solution, the only ones left, however improbable, are the only solutions.
Isn't that Occam's razor or something like that?
I think Sherlock may have read Occam. But the idea is, ultimately, what's causing the whole crisis is the level of private debt. It's too high, you've got to reduce it somehow. If you reduce it by people simply paying off their debt in the usual fashion of going bankrupt or paying down out of their income, you remain in a permanent slump, which is where the Japanese have been for the last 25 years. If you use the state's capacity to create money and cancel that debt, which we could do, you could wipe it all out and start again. So
Donald Trump's idea of borrowing trillions in order to rebuild the infrastructure, maybe have a more green and eco-friendly sort of infrastructure system and employing all these people just like FDR did during the Great Depression. Now, I also want to point out, because we were talking about China, and China and the U.S. seem very interlinked in this whole fiasco that has caused America not to be so great anymore, is that China could force their corporations and banks and whatever to do whatever they want, right? In America, that doesn't happen. So how do we change? Part of the solution is the fact that U.S. corporate debt, which has built up, was not even used productively. It was just used to buy back shares, not for CapEx. This little green line, this is the latest cycle we're in. They're not using it for any sort of capital expenditure. It's all for share buybacks. Why does this matter? And should it change? How can it change?
It matters immensely because the only sensible reason for increasing debt is to finance investment when it exceeds your retained earnings. Okay? That's when you use it productively. That's what Schumpeter thought banks did. And if banks were doing that, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Instead, what they're doing is financing asset speculation, driving up asset prices. They're not creating more assets, not creating more productive capacity. So we need to make the banking sector serve the industrial sector and serve manufacturers again, as it did to a large degree back in the 1950s and 60s.
So that's going to be Congress is going to have to change legislation, or the
Congress
Treasury?
would need to change legislation. You'd need to change what the banks are allowed to lend to do. I would stop the banks. I'd ban margin lending for a start.
That's something
I'd ban
Max
it
Well,
said,
I've
outright.
said many times that the central bank overnight could raise the margin rate without
Yeah.
changing the other rates that
That's
are
true.
on offer from these central banks, raise the cost of speculation.
Yeah.
And in so doing, get rid of a huge layer of predatory financiers, which they can, Mark Carney or Janet Yellen can do that in a day.
They could do it rapidly.
Just
yeah.
raise the margin rate.
Now, a lot of bankers and those sorts of
So in other words, wait, the summer
Yeah.
solution is my solution?
There you go.
Okay,
Yep.
okay.
Okay,
Yep.
I came up with the summer solution. This episode, raise the margin rate, Mark Carney, Janet Yellen, other central bankers. As I've said many times before, Steve Keen, he's a freaking professor. He writes books. He agrees with me. Stacey Herbert also agrees with me.
Now, of course, many speculators will screech about this. They
Oh, that'd be so
screech,
tragic.
They still screech about Paul Volcker 25, 30 years later when he had interest rates quite high. Now, one thing it did do is when money is more expensive to borrow, it does force those who are lazy, who can't think of any other idea but to buy back their own shares. It seems like now is the perfect time to raise the cost of their money because they don't know how to spend it wisely. So you need to force them to think about how they're deploying
Yeah, it's
capital.
called competition.
Yeah.
Make them compete for
We
the
solved
money.
it all. We solved it
Make
all.
them come up with decent ideas, which they don't do at the moment.
They have no good ideas, but share buybacks, that's dumb.
Yeah, yeah. And it's reducing the capital base at a speculative cost to the economy. They get a high inflated share price and they get out with the benefit of having pushed up the shareholders' value. But actually at the same time, the real value of creating capacity of the American economy is destroyed.
All right, well, on that note, we got to go. Steve Keen, thank you.
Thank you again.
Thanks for being part of Summer Solutions once again.
Awesome. That's it for this episode of the Keiser Report Summer Solutions 2016 series with Max Keiser, Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Professor Steve Keen. If you'd like to get in touch, tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.